In the shadows of Chicago, where the wind howls through dark alleys and history is written in blood, there once lived a man so feared, so untouchable, that even the police dared not speak his name too loudly. They called him Tokyo Joe. He wasn't just another gangster chasing money and power. He was a mastermind who built an empire brick by brick, body by body, until his legend was etched deep into the soul of the city. But here's the chilling truth. His story didn't end with his downfall. The empire he forged didn't vanish. It transformed. From smoky backrooms where bribes flowed freely to polished boardrooms where influence still lingers, the fingerprints of Tokyo Joe's underworld remain scattered across modern Chicago. His reign may have faded, but his legacy continues to pulse beneath the surface, silent yet unbreakable. Tonight, we tear open the files they never wanted you to see. We'll walk through the blood-soaked streets where mob wars turned neighborhoods into battlefields and step inside the secret deals that shaped the city's future. From ruthless betrayals to hidden power plays, this isn't just a history lesson. It's a revelation. Because the Chicago mob didn't die. It simply learned how to hide in plain sight. Welcome to the real story. Chicago Mob Exposed. From Tokyo Joe's ruthless reign to today's hidden power. Chicago's history has always carried the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and ambition. The city we know today, bustling with skyscrapers, culture, and commerce, was once a battlefield where power wasn't earned in elections or boardrooms, but in dark alleys with a gun in hand. Names like Al Capone dominate Hollywood movies and history books, but hidden beneath the shadow of these legends was another figure, one whose story is rarely told, yet whose impact was undeniable. His name was Tokyo Joe. Tokyo Joe was more than just another gangster in the Chicago underworld. He was a strategist, a tactician, and a man who understood that true power came not just from violence, but from control. He built his empire on gambling, extortion, and illicit deals, carving out a criminal kingdom where loyalty was demanded and betrayal was punished in blood. His reign was short-lived in the grand scheme of mob history, but the foundations he laid reshaped the very rules of organized crime in Chicago. Yet, this story isn't just about one man. It's about the machine he helped build. Because the mob didn't disappear when Tokyo Joe fell, it evolved. From street wars fought with Tommy guns to secret handshakes with politicians and businessmen, the Chicago mob learned how to blend violence with influence. They discovered that fear could control neighborhoods, but money and connections could control entire cities. In this journey, we'll walk the path from Chicago's blood-soaked past to its shadowy present. We'll uncover the rise of Tokyo Joe, the brutal mob wars that followed, the quiet reinvention of gangsters into legitimate businessmen, and finally, the chilling reality of how their influence still echoes in Chicago today. This is not just history, it's revelation. Welcome to Chicago Mob Exposed. From Tokyo Joe's ruthless reign to today's hidden power. Chicago in the mid-20th century was a city of contradictions. By day, the streets pulsed with industry, music, and the rhythm of working-class life. But by night, shadows stretched long across the alleys, and a different rhythm echoed. The sound of whispered deals, clinking glasses in backroom bars, and the sharp crack of gunfire that reminded everyone who truly ruled the streets. In this world of hidden power and ruthless ambition, a man emerged whose name carried both mystery and fear. They called him Tokyo. Joe Little is truly known about his earliest years, and perhaps that is what made him all the more dangerous. His origins were cloaked in half-truths, rumors, and deliberate myths, stories whispered in smoke-filled rooms about a man who came from nothing, but who carried the fire of ambition in his eyes. Some said he had ties to sailors who brought him into the city. Others claimed he had been a street hustler before climbing into organized crime. What mattered most, however, was not where he came from, but how he rose. Tokyo Joe had one quality that separated him from the countless young men trying to carve out a place in Chicago's underworld: calculation. While others sought quick money and glory, he thought like a chess player. Every move was deliberate, every ally chosen carefully, and every rival dealt with in a way that sent a message. He first sank his teeth into gambling rackets, running small operations that seemed insignificant at first. But with each bet placed, with each dollar taken, his control expanded. He was ruthless in collecting debts, yet strangely fair to those who stayed loyal. This balance of fear and respect became his trademark. As his power grew, so did his reputation. Tokyo Joe wasn't a man who shouted his name from the rooftops. He let others spread the stories for him. A gambler who tried to cheat him was found beaten in an alley, his hands broken beyond repair. A bar owner who thought he could refuse protection money vanished one night, his business mysteriously burned to the ground the next day. These weren't random acts of violence, they were carefully staged lessons, and the city was learning. By the time his name reached the lips of police officers, Tokyo Joe was no longer a small-time hustler. He controlled entire blocks, with men loyal to him scattered across gambling dens, speakeasies, and backroom clubs. His network wasn't flashy, it was efficient. He made sure the money flowed upward, greasing the palms of corrupt officials and keeping law enforcement either too afraid or too well paid to interfere. He wasn't just running rackets. He was building an empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar, body by body. What made him especially dangerous was his ability to adapt. Unlike other mobsters who relied only on intimidation, Tokyo Joe understood the psychology of power. He studied people, their weaknesses, their desires, and used them like pieces in his game. Politicians who wanted votes found themselves indebted to him. Businessmen desperate for protection signed away their freedom without even realizing it. And young men searching for belonging were drawn into his crew, ready to kill or die at his command. It wasn't long before Tokyo Joe's shadow stretched beyond the underworld. Police reports mentioned him in whispers, but rarely with concrete evidence. Journalists tried to dig into his story, but sources dried up quickly, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they disappeared altogether. His face was rarely photographed, and when it was, he looked more like a sharp businessman than a blood-soaked gangster. That was the illusion he wanted the world to see. Yet behind the polished suits and quiet demeanor lay a man of iron will. Loyalty was rewarded, but betrayal was answered with brutality. One of his closest lieutenants, suspected of skimming profits, was found floating in the river, his fate serving as a warning to anyone else tempted to step out of line. These acts weren't just punishments. They were performances, staged to reinforce his legend. Tokyo Joe understood that in the world of crime, reputation was as powerful as a bullet. His rise was not without challenges. Rival gangs saw him as a threat, and clashes erupted in the streets. But Tokyo Joe thrived in conflict. He was patient, waiting for his enemies to make mistakes, then striking when the time was right. Slowly, he dismantled his rivals, not just by killing them, but by absorbing their men, their businesses, and their influence. Each victory expanded his reach, until it seemed like no corner of Chicago's criminal world was untouched by his hand. By the height of his reign, Tokyo Joe had become more than a gangster. He was an institution. His empire stretched across gambling, extortion, and underground markets, and the city itself seemed to bend around his will. Police feared him, politicians bargained with him, and ordinary citizens whispered his name with equal parts awe and dread. To many, he was invisible, a phantom pulling strings from the shadows. To others, he was a storm, violent, unstoppable, and inevitable. Tokyo Joe's rise wasn't just about money or violence. It was about power, pure, unshakable power. And in Chicago, during those years, there was no greater force than the man whose name echoed in every darkened alley, every hushed conversation, every deal made in smoke-filled rooms. His legend was written not in headlines, but in fear. And as the city would soon discover, what Tokyo Joe had built was far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. Power, in the world of organized crime, is never left unchallenged. The stronger Tokyo Joe became, the more his shadow stretched across Chicago, the more enemies emerged from the darkness, unwilling to surrender their piece of the city's blood-soaked empire. Rival gangs, long established and fiercely territorial, saw him as an intruder, an outsider who had no right to command respect in their streets. And so, the stage was set for one of the most brutal chapters in the history of Chicago's underworld. The first sparks of conflict came quietly. A gambling den controlled by one of Joe's lieutenants was raided not by police, but by masked gunmen working for a rival crew. Money was stolen, men were beaten, and a message was sent. Tokyo Joe was not untouchable. But if his enemies expected fear or retreat, they miscalculated. Joe's response was swift, calculated, and merciless. Within a week, the man suspected of organizing the raid was gunned down outside his home, his body riddled with bullets in front of neighbors who knew better than to speak. It wasn't just revenge, it was a declaration of war. What followed was a cycle of bloodshed that turned Chicago into a battlefield. Drive-by shootings rattled the nights. Businesses burned in suspicious fires. Men vanished, never to be seen again, their absence explained only by whispers of concrete shoes and the dark waters of the river. Families who lived near mob-controlled territories learned to stay indoors after sundown, for fear of being caught in the crossfire. Chicago was a city divided, and Tokyo Joe was at the center of the storm. But Joe didn't fight with brute force alone. Unlike his rivals who relied on intimidation and numbers, he fought with strategy. He understood that fear could control the streets, but influence could control the city. While bullets flew in alleys, he made quiet moves behind closed doors. Politicians on the take began passing ordinances that crippled his enemies' businesses. Union leaders, bought and paid for, ensured that construction contracts and city projects went to companies loyal to him. Slowly, his rivals realized they weren't just losing men. They were losing ground, losing money, losing the very lifeblood of their power. The mob wars reached their peak in a single year, when Chicago seemed to drown in violence. Newspapers reported a string of unsolved murders, each more brutal than the last. One rival boss was ambushed while leaving a nightclub, his car riddled with gunfire until it resembled a sieve. Another was dragged from his home in the dead of night, his body discovered days later in an abandoned warehouse, his face unrecognizable. Police reports hinted at an orchestrated campaign, but evidence vanished as quickly as it appeared. Witnesses recanted, files disappeared, and officers who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned, or worse. Through it all, Tokyo Joe's legend only grew. To his men, he was a general, leading them with precision and purpose. To his enemies, he was a phantom, always one step ahead, striking from the shadows before disappearing back into the night. He built an army not through fear alone, but through loyalty. His men were paid well, treated with respect, and bound by an unbreakable code. Loyalty to Joe meant security, betrayal meant death. Yet the cost of this war was high. Innocent lives were caught in the crossfire, businesses destroyed, neighborhoods destabilized. Chicago became a city living in tension, where every loud noise at night sent shivers down spines. Mothers prayed their sons wouldn't be recruited, or worse, killed. Shopkeepers paid protection money just to keep their doors open. The mob's grip was suffocating, and Tokyo Joe's hand was one of the heaviest. But Joe was not reckless. He knew endless bloodshed could draw too much attention, and attention was dangerous. Slowly, as his dominance became clear, the war began to cool. Rivals who survived either fled the city, went underground, or reluctantly bent the knee. Territories once contested fell firmly under his control. The unions, the gambling dens, the nightclubs, they all answered to him. This was not just victory, it was transformation. The mob wars had proven that Tokyo Joe was not a man to be challenged. He had shown his rivals that violence could silence them, shown politicians that he could not be ignored, and shown the city itself that his power was absolute. Chicago belonged to him, not through official title or public recognition, but through fear, money, and blood. Yet, in the shadows of his triumph, new dangers brewed. Success made him untouchable in the streets, but it also made him visible to those watching from higher places, detectives, prosecutors, and federal agents who were beginning to realize that Chicago had traded one kingpin for another. And though the wars had ended, the peace Tokyo Joe created was built on fragile ground. For in the underworld, there is no such thing as permanent victory, only the quiet before the storm. Power in the underworld is intoxicating, but it is also corrosive. For years, Tokyo Joe had ruled Chicago's criminal empire with precision and brutality, bending the city to his will. But every empire, no matter how strong, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. For Tokyo Joe, that destruction began not with his enemies on the street, but with betrayal from within. The first cracks in his empire were subtle. Whispers began to circulate that some of his men were unhappy, resentful of the riches Joe hoarded at the top while they risked their lives in the streets. Others, tired of the endless cycle of bloodshed, saw an opportunity to defect to rival crews who promised more freedom and profit. Joe, ever the strategist, dismissed these murmurs at first. He believed fear and loyalty would keep his men in line, as it always had. But loyalty, he would soon discover, is a fragile currency. It was a single betrayal that triggered the chain of events leading to his fall. One of his most trusted lieutenants, a man who had stood by his side for years, was secretly feeding information to federal agents. Every meeting, every shipment, every hidden stash house was quietly mapped and logged. Joe had always prided himself on being untouchable, but slowly, invisibly, the walls were closing in. Law enforcement, once powerless against him, began to strike with precision. Raids disrupted his operations, bank accounts were frozen, and allies in politics who once protected him began to distance themselves. The very officials who had pocketed his bribes now spoke of justice, desperate to save their own reputations. For the first time in years, Tokyo Joe was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. As the pressure mounted, paranoia began to consume him. He grew suspicious of everyone, even the men closest to him. Meetings once filled with laughter and confidence now descended into silence, each man wondering who among them might be the next traitor. Joe's legendary calm calculation gave way to sudden bursts of rage. Men who had been with him since the beginning were executed on the faintest suspicion of betrayal. Instead of strengthening his grip, these purges weakened it, driving more of his crew into the arms of rivals or into the waiting hands of the authorities. The streets sensed his vulnerability. Rivals he had once crushed now resurfaced, emboldened by his decline. Territory that had been firmly under his control slipped through his fingers, either seized by competitors or abandoned altogether. Where once his name inspired fear and silence, now it was spoken with something more dangerous: doubt. The illusion of invincibility that had shielded him for so long was gone. The final blow came not from a bullet, but from the system he had always believed he could outsmart. Federal prosecutors unveiled a sweeping case against him, built on the testimony of informants and mountains of evidence collected over years. Tokyo Joe, who had once moved like a ghost through the city, was dragged into the harsh light of a courtroom. The man who had made judges and politicians bow their heads now stood shackled before them, powerless. But even here, Joe tried to play the game. He smirked at reporters, whispered threats to witnesses, and carried himself with the same cold confidence that had built his empire. Yet, behind the facade, he knew the truth. His kingdom had crumbled. The men who once swore loyalty were now testifying against him, trading his secrets for their own freedom. The empire he had sacrificed everything to build was dismantled piece by piece, until all that remained was a man facing decades behind bars. For the city, his downfall was a victory. Headlines declared that Chicago's most feared mobster had finally been brought to justice. But for those who had lived under his reign, there was no celebration, only a strange, hollow silence. They knew that removing Tokyo Joe did not kill the mob. It simply created a vacuum, one that would soon be filled by others hungry for the same power, willing to spill the same blood. Tokyo Joe's fall was not just the story of one man's betrayal or one empire's collapse. It was a reminder of the cycle that defines organized crime, the rise, the reign, and the inevitable fall. His name, once whispered with fear, became a cautionary tale, proof that no matter how ruthless, no matter how careful, no man in the underworld is ever truly untouchable. When Tokyo Joe's empire collapsed, many believed it marked the end of an era. Chicago had witnessed the rise and fall of yet another crime lord, and authorities boasted that the city was finally free of mob influence. But history has a cruel sense of irony. For every kingpin who falls, another rises, not always with guns blazing, but with sharper suits, softer words, and smarter tactics. The mob did not die with Tokyo Joe, it evolved. Gone were the days of Tommy guns spraying bullets in crowded streets. The new generation of gangsters understood that too much blood brought too much attention. Instead, they learned to wear masks of respectability. They traded the shadows of back alleys for the polished glow of restaurants, casinos, and office towers. They didn't just want power. They wanted legitimacy. And so began the mob's reinvention, from feared street killers to gentlemen businessmen. The transformation was as strategic as it was necessary. Law enforcement had grown sharper, federal agencies more aggressive, and the old ways of violence first no longer guaranteed survival. The mob adapted by diversifying its operations. Gambling and extortion still lined their pockets, but now the money was laundered through construction companies, trucking firms, and even entertainment venues. To the public eye, these were successful businessmen. Behind closed doors, they remained ruthless criminals. Labor unions became one of their most powerful tools. With control over unions, the mob controlled entire industries, construction, shipping, and manufacturing. They could decide which projects thrived, which collapsed, and which politicians received support. It was no longer about ruling neighborhoods. It was about ruling the very backbone of the city's economy. And they did it with handshakes instead of bullets, contracts instead of kidnappings. But beneath the surface, the code of silence remained unchanged. Betrayal was still punished, only now the methods were quieter. A missing accountant here, a sudden accident on a job site there. Violence hadn't vanished. It had simply been dressed in a suit and tie, disguised as bad luck or business disputes. To outsiders, it seemed like the mob had cleaned up its act. To insiders, nothing had truly changed, only the style of control. What made this reinvention so effective was its invisibility. Politicians who once feared mobsters with guns now welcomed mobsters with donations. Judges who once condemned racketeering now shook hands with men whose money built schools and hospitals, never asking where the funds came from. The mob learned that true power was not in being feared, but in being needed. And in that shift, their grip on Chicago tightened in ways even Tokyo Joe might never have imagined. Casinos became another cornerstone of this transformation. Where underground gambling dens had once been raided and shut down, now the mob found ways to funnel their influence into legal casinos across state lines. Money poured in, washed clean by the lights and noise of legitimate business. What had once been a crime was now a multi-million-dollar industry, and the mob was at its heart. The faces of these new gangsters reflected the change. They weren't scarred street fighters, but smooth-talking men in tailored suits, Men who could sit across from a banker, a mayor, or a senator and hold their own. They smiled, shook hands, signed contracts, and left their enemies wondering whether they were dealing with a businessman or a killer. In truth, they were both. Chicago changed with them. Neighborhoods once plagued by open gunfire saw calmer streets, but behind the quiet came something more insidious: invisible control. The mob was no longer just a shadow in the alleys. It was embedded in the city's very foundation. To most citizens, life seemed normal. To those who knew better, it was clear. The mob hadn't vanished. It had simply gone corporate. And so, while Tokyo Joe's reign ended in blood and betrayal, his legacy lived on in a new form. His empire was not destroyed. It was reshaped. The ruthless lessons he taught about power, loyalty, and fear were not forgotten. They were studied, refined, and polished into something more dangerous than violence could ever achieve: legitimacy. Chicago's mobsters had become gentlemen. But beneath the smiles and the handshakes, the heart of the beast still beat, as cold and merciless as ever. Chicago today is a city of bright lights, towering skyscrapers, and global influence. To most of the world, it stands as a symbol of progress and opportunity. But beneath the polished steel and glass, behind the noise of traffic and commerce, lies a quieter truth, a truth that refuses to die. The mob may no longer rule with the open violence of Tokyo Joe's reign, but its influence has not disappeared. It has only grown more sophisticated, more invisible, and perhaps more dangerous than ever before. Modern mob influence is not about street corner shootouts or bloody wars in alleys. It is about infiltration, about weaving into the very fabric of society so subtly that most people never realize it. The same unions that once carried the mob's fingerprints still bear their mark. Construction companies, shipping firms, waste management contracts, industries that shape the city's economy have long been breeding grounds for mob control. In these places, deals are struck not at gunpoint but over handshakes, sealed with money and quiet promises. And yet, violence never truly vanished. It simply changed its face. Instead of the public spectacles of the past, today's punishments are hidden, disguised as accidents, overdoses, or sudden disappearances. A union boss who refused to play along is found dead in his car. The case ruled a suicide. A businessman who turned on his mob-connected partners vanishes during a weekend trip. His body never recovered. The blood is still there. It just stains the city's foundation instead of its streets. The mob's reach stretches far beyond Chicago itself. With global money flows, they have invested in casinos, nightclubs, and real estate projects across the country, and even overseas. Technology has provided new opportunities: cybercrime, money laundering through digital systems, and networks that span continents. Where Tokyo Joe once ruled blocks of Chicago, today's mobsters manipulate international deals worth millions, often hidden behind layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. Politicians remain entangled in the web. Campaign donations, endorsements, and quiet favors still connect organized crime to the very halls of power. For decades, rumors have swirled about backroom deals that protect certain businesses or allow certain projects to move forward. No one speaks openly, but everyone understands. Mob money has a way of finding its way into the hands of those who make decisions. Street gangs, too, have not escaped the mob's shadow. In some neighborhoods, alliances have formed between old crime families and modern street crews. The gangs provide manpower, the families provide connections, and together they control drug pipelines, weapons markets, and territory. The violence may look different from Tokyo Joe's day, but the machinery of organized crime continues to grind forward. What makes this hidden power so chilling is its subtlety. In the days of Tokyo Joe, fear was visible, blood on the pavement, headlines screaming of gangland killings. Today, the fear is quieter, but no less real. It's the fear of businessmen who know they can't compete unless they pay the right people. The fear of politicians who realize that crossing the wrong man could end their career or their life. The fear of ordinary citizens who sense that, despite the city's shine, corruption still lurks in the corners they cannot see. And through it all, Tokyo Joe's shadow lingers. His philosophy of power through calculation, his ability to combine fear with influence, set the template for what came after him. He proved that brute force alone could not sustain an empire, that true dominance came from merging the underworld with the legitimate world until the two were inseparable. That lesson became the blueprint for the generations of mobsters who followed. Even today, when officials proudly declare victories against organized crime, whispers suggest otherwise. Files vanish. Witnesses retract their statements. Court cases collapse without explanation. The system itself, in many ways, has learned to live with the mob rather than defeat it. Some argue that Chicago is no longer a city fighting the mob, it is a city shaped by it. So, was Tokyo Joe's legacy destroyed when he fell? Or did it evolve, slip into new hands, and spread into every corner of modern life? The answer may be both. His reign ended in betrayal and handcuffs, but the empire he helped build survived, mutating into something less visible but more enduring. The names may have changed, but the power remains. And that is the most haunting truth of all. The Chicago mob did not die. It learned to hide in plain sight. It learned to dress in suits, to speak in polite tones, to smile at cameras while pulling strings behind closed doors. The violence, the corruption, the control, they are all still here, only hidden beneath layers of legitimacy. So the next time you walk through Chicago, past the glittering skyline and bustling streets, remember the shad.